Welcome and good afternoon and good evening to everyone, or good morning to those joining us today for Network 2020's discussion about Tunisia's constitutional referendum. I'm extremely pleased to be able to have this conversation, in part because Network 2020 has been working on a project about Tunisia for the past year, and it is ongoing. So this is a topic that's close to our hearts. And it's a real pleasure to be able to bring some experts in to talk with us about this today. Really quickly as background for those who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020, we are an inclusive international community. We're bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. And we run a whole number of different programs, including these educational ones. We also do foreign affairs discussion groups, and we have deep dives on different topics. And we're really working on a lot of different fronts. And so it's, please do check our website and social media, follow us on social media to get the latest on what we're working on. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have Aymen Bessalah. He is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on governance and the rule of law in Tunisia. And he is the author of a recent LA Times article that I thought was just gave an excellent perspective on the referendum. And I hope we'll be able to put that in the chat at some point. We have next Lilia Blaise, and she is a Franco-Tunisian journalist. She's based in Tunisia and has worked for many outlets, including Le Monde, France 24, and the New York Times as well. So welcome, Lilia. And last but not least, we have Nate Grubman, who is a teaching fellow in civic, liberal, and global education at Stanford University. So welcome to the three of you. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today. So just to start us off, let me find my questions. They disappear on me. Hang on one moment. Disappear. So, where are they? Nate, let me see if I can, I'm going to start with you as soon as I can get my Zoom to cooperate. And it is, I wanted to start with you. And could you just summarize the nature and the causes of the economic and social grievances that Tunisians faced leading up to the referendum, just so that we're all on the same page?
Thank you. Well, first, I want to thank Network 2020 for putting this together and giving me an opportunity to participate in a conversation with two people whose work I really greatly admire. I think it's important to look back at the transition as a whole in terms of how we got here. This transition started in January 2011 when former dictator Ben Ali fled the country. And at the time, many Tunisians expected democracy to have, in addition to having an intrinsic value, to have an instrumental value as well, to be able to deliver outcomes such as a stronger economy, stability, some of these things. Now, these expectations were based in the fact that Tunisia had been governed by a single party state for several decades, and that in recent years, that party state had increasingly been controlled by one family that many Tunisians accuse of being a sort of a band of thieves. So many Tunisians expected that getting rid of Ben Ali, perhaps returning some of that looted wealth, and bringing more voices into the conversation would produce better governance. Politicians at the time made big promises about democracy's ability to deliver. You had political parties promising to create hundreds of thousands of jobs over several years, growth rates of 7 or 8%. So people had very high expectations. The transition that followed has been a difficult one for many Tunisians. We can look at sort of the summary economic statistics, declining GDP per capita, for example, a stubbornly high unemployment rate, inflation that has been quite difficult on many Tunisians in the past several years, a perception that that public services have gotten worse. That includes the security sector, but also things like the healthcare system, the education system, and then a sense that corruption has expanded as well, that there's been sort of this democratization of corruption. Now, in 2019, when Kais Saied was elected, he was one of many politicians who at the time were trying to mobilize these grievances politically. Kais Saied was promising to restore Tunisia to a moment before which its political transition had gone wrong, and to restore the capacity of the state to deliver good outcomes to Tunisians. Now, in my research, at the time in 2019, I did a survey in which, along with a co-author, Milan Svolik at Yale, and we asked Tunisians about their memories of various aspects of social and economic life. We asked them about different facts, such as the unemployment rate today, the unemployment rate before the revolution, the cost of gas today, the cost of gas before the revolution, the crime rate today, the crime rate before the revolution. And what we noticed is that not only do many people perceive things to have gotten worse in these regards, majorities, in fact, but a large percentage of Tunisians actually have unfairly rosy memories of the past, that they remember things as being better than they in fact were. So Kais Saied has stepped in. He has posed as a savior, and he has been able to sort of mobilize these grievances and making the argument that clarifying responsibility in his hands, allowing him to step in and be the savior, will deliver better outcomes to Tunisians.
Thank you, Nate. That's very helpful and great point about the research as well. And that's a good segue over to you, Lilia, with sort of that on the ground perspective, right? So I'd love to just hear from you about how Tunisians were reacting towards Kais Saied's moves in 2021 and how they're responding now, and what you think these responses say about Tunisians' relationships with the political system in general.
Yes, so to give you the picture, I would say only 1 year passed since the 25th of July last year and the referendum, which happened a few weeks ago, but it felt like a lot of years because, you know, basically everything that was built in Tunisia for 10 years was completely challenged during this past year. What I can say is that I would describe the feeling or the general feeling on the 25th of July last year as a momentum. It was really a momentum, and Kais Saied really seized a political opportunity. You had a sanitary crisis, vaccines were taking a lot of time to come to Tunisia, and people were dying of COVID. You had a political crisis, the parliament couldn't agree on anything. And it was really a political opportunity to seize for him to take power and establish a new political system, which he worked on, which he has been working on for a lot of years. And it was supported by a lot of people. There were flocks of people in the streets the night he took the decision. And it's important to say that, you know, because at the time, from abroad or from a distance, everyone was saying, what is he doing? Can he do that? Does he have the right? Are we, you know, watching a coup? And in Tunisia, it was more complicated. You know, you had a general enthusiasm, and you had people who were really fed up with the political system, who were supporting Kais Saied. And it was a moment of communion that I would say we had not seen since the revolution, where elites, most, you know, civil society, and also the people were kind of agreeing on the fact that he took the good decision. But, you know, there were already criticism about the fact that he violated the constitution. He had a very large interpretation of what he could do, such as, you know, freezing the parliament, which was not mentioned in the constitution. So it was this kind of very, very troubling time, because, you know, you had enthusiasm. And I remember a lot of people from civil society recently told me we couldn't go against the flow, we couldn't go against the general popular opinion, we couldn't take a stand. And also, I think what is also interesting is that the political parties who were not at all supporting what was happening directly dive into the opposition side. And there was no time for, take a step back and say, what we did wrong. And I didn't hear any political party actually, take responsibility for what happened before and what led to that, And so that was why civil society took a lot of time to actually have a general vision about what was happening. You had red flags all over the year, and you had associations and NGOs defending human rights taking stands, but it was a very difficult time to actually criticize Kais Saied. And I think a lot of Tunisian, especially intellectuals, felt this way, because as Nate described, there was so much anger towards the political system, which failed to provide basic needs for Tunisians, that, he was seen not only as a savior, but as someone who would be changing what the political system, but also taking responsibility because he was monopolizing powers. I would say there was a shift in September when he enacted the law decree saying that, the country would be ruled by only decrees that he would be able to enact, and also that there was no possibility of appeal. So I think that was the first shifting moment where people, especially in civil society, starting to say that's not normal, and we should be aware that it's a very dangerous path he's taking, because we went from an exceptional time with exceptional measures, justified somewhat by articles in the constitution, to the rule of only one man, And then, he basically gave his roadmap under pressure, and we moved forward until the referendum with a lot of, problems, such as the dismantling of most institutions which, were created after the revolution, such as the High Council of Justice, which was supposed to guarantee the independence of justice, the final dissolution of the parliament, the closing of a commission which was fighting corruption. And so all these red flags start worrying some of the people who were hesitant on the 25th and who were supporting him, but who, were also seeing the way it could lead to an authoritarian regime. Now, I would say after the referendum, it's still difficult to describe the general feeling, because Kais Saied basically had some legitimacy with this referendum, because he managed to get 2.8 million Tunisians to vote a yes for his new constitution. And even if the participation rate was low, it was only 30.5%, it's not that low for a Tunisian election. So he still managed, after a year alone in power and no big change in the economy, as Nate say, there hasn't been any change. He managed to still sort of capitalize on the momentum he got. And I think that's very important. There are still people trusting him, and they're not completely blindly trusting him like we heard just after the 25th of July. It's more cautious. I heard a lot of people saying during the referendum, for instance, we trust him, but he needs to deliver, otherwise we will have done that for nothing. And there is also this general feeling that he was not able to work as he wanted before the referendum, because he was still prevented by the political opposition, the international pressure on, his roadmap, and, trying to make a political structure. So now people are saying now he can finally work, like, let's see what he's going to do. So I would say it's really interesting, because you see it's like a sort of emotional elevator of different feelings during the whole year. But I would say it's not the same enthusiasm because clearly, you know, people still learn that democracy, you know, you have to have pillars of democracy and things that you don't touch, such as freedoms, such as, you know, freedom of expression, the independence of justice. And so I think people are aware that maybe there is a risk for, you know, authoritarian shift, but there's also a lot of there are also a lot of expectations, which makes it very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Lilia. And you mentioned too that difference between the outlook from the international community and the fact that it's a lot more complicated on the ground. And so using that as a jumping off point, Aymen, I'd love to turn to you because for those of us who are reading about the referendum here in the United States, you know, a lot of the articles I've read have very much focused on this idea of the death of democracy. However, this piece that you wrote in the LA Times, I thought was interesting because you echoed what in the Network 2020 group when we went to Tunisia heard from a lot of people, which is also, you know, don't write us off just yet. Things are still young and there's still hope. And so you really send an optimistic message for democracy in Tunisia. So could you dig into that a little bit for us and just tell us what you see as some of the possibilities for future of democracy in Tunisia?
Thank you very much, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this panel. A small correction before I start. Was written by myself and Aymen Bessalah, whom I salute using this opportunity. I think before delving into that, it's important to highlight that I think the experience that we have had so far can be described as a flawed democracy. And that's, I guess, is the bulk of the issue and why people tend to jump into conclusions saying democracy is over, and why people did not feel that way, as many still don't feel that way, actually. For most of the political elite, democratization was over with the ratification of the constitution in 2014 and the elections. And so, okay, we've finished building, now we're a democracy and things can go back to business as usual. Whereas arbitrary state actions against citizens continued, mainly due to the bulk of the judicial arsenal and the legal arsenal that remained enforced despite constitutional, which is the same being used by Saied at the moment. By the way, they all date back to dictatorship. Even the institution building, the constitutional institution building itself was not concluded, as the decentralization process was not finished. The constitutional court was not put in place. The independent constitutional authorities also. That, and at the same time, the fact that political practice by parties was linked to elections, and basically that was it. And then they would engage in consensus, which granted has its benefits, but the political costs were that political responsibility was diluted, and there was a rift between citizens' grievances and the priorities or the policies or lack thereof that were being put in place. That plus the fact that there was what we refer to as the parliamentary mercato or tourism, wherein you had deputies switching parliamentary blocks within parliament right after elections sometimes. And we even had an instance where a party was formed after the elections, but still managed to have a bloc that was part of the ruling coalition, and its leader as the head of government after they separated from Nidja Tunis. So all of these like practices, in addition to the lack of trust between political actors and seeking to basically position themselves not to be isolated by their political opponents, really had an effect on people's perception of what democracy is and political practices are. And under this light, I think Kais Saied's rhetoric and that of his supporters is in fact not unsubstantiated, and is actually also widely shared by a number of civil society actors and even some parties, which explains, as Lilia mentioned, the initial wait and see and even statements of support to what happened in July 21. Now, to link to your question on what can we expect, transitions are never linear, and given the variety of hosts of different variables in play at the moment, it is difficult to say with precision what might happen, but I think they depend mainly on a number of dynamics, most important of which is whether or not political parties, namely opposition parties, would engage in an evaluation of their experience in power, especially those who reached power via parliament, actually having deputies in parliament or being in ruling coalitions, but also engage in a change of leadership. Because the issue is that a large number of political leaders are quite unliked, to say the least, by the majority of citizens, which also, to link to what Lilia said, explains the low participation rate, the 30.5% participation rate in the referendum. But the 70% is not to be interpreted as active boycott. It's not all of it active boycott. I think large majority of it is people being apathetic, and it is also in line with the downtrend of turnout rates from election to election. But even the 2,800,000 that voted yes, not all of them voted for the text. Many voted for Saied himself, but most importantly, many voted against the political elite. So the support and the popularity that Kais Saied enjoys are actually the lack that other actors have. And given that, I think depending on how Saied consolidates his power and how the opposition would organize itself, everything goes basically, and we're still a long way from saying that there's a moratorium on democracy and transition, and we're back to 29 or 2010. I will stop here, not to take much of the time, and maybe we can develop more later.
Great, thank you, Aymen. That was very helpful. Nate, turning back to you, and I feel like we've started to reference this at different points, this disconnect between what Tunisians believe democracy could achieve and the realities they face, both in terms of what Tunisians expected and sort of perhaps what the political elite either thought that they could deliver and could not. So how do these complications affect the outcomes of what people wanted and what they want? Because it seems like that there's a complicated history with democracy there. So how would you respond to that? You're muted.
I'm really bad at that. It's a character flaw. I think Aymen pointed to a lot of the ways in which democratization was sort of incomplete before Kais Saied took power. Some of the shortcomings, perhaps, or some of the sources of grievances in Tunisia's democracy were the results of choices made early in the transition. So Tunisia had a political system that really privileged representing, kind of maximizing pluralism, having low barriers to entry into electoral politics. There were very many political parties in the country, and many of them were able to enjoy representation in the parliament. The flip side of, and that system, I think, was adopted in part because of the concerns regarding the possibility of a return to strongman rule after Ben Ali had been in power since 1987. But the problem with that is it does obscure responsibility for governing. So Tunisia had, going back since, since 2015 at least, governments that represented a very large percentage of the legislature, and governments also that included a number of independent figures or figures who represented very small political parties, even parties that didn't win election into the legislature. And I think that that there was also, I think Aymen is right to point to the weakness of political parties in Tunisia. He referenced party tourism in the Constituent Assembly. If we look outside of Ennahda, approximately half of the representatives in the assembly ended up changing their party. We see very similar dynamics after the 2014 election, and then the legislature that was elected in 2019 was extremely fractious as well. I think it's important to focus on the question of why Tunisia's transition has failed to answer these demands for less corruption and better governance. In some ways, Tunisia has, the government passed some really progressive or admirable laws regarding freedom of information, protecting whistleblowers, requiring politicians to declare their assets. But for many reasons, these laws failed to deliver good governance and also to address the perception that corruption was very widespread. I think Aymen made a really interesting point that the dictatorship, that the future is unknown here. We don't know, how consolidated this dictatorship will be, if it will continue. I would say that it is one today, in the sense that that Kais Saied today is governing without a legislature. I think, according to pretty much any definition of democracy, the system today is undemocratic. But there are ways in which his power still does seem to remain limited. He doesn't seem to have kind of infinite power to use the judiciary to repress the opposition today. I have questions about the degree to which the military is willing to follow him, although it has, it was there to lock down the parliament in July 2021. Aymen suggested, I think quite correctly, that we are not back in 2010 today. This system looks very different than the system that was in place at that time. And I doubt that that Kais Saied is going to be able to establish the same sort of authoritarian system as existed at the time. But I think that still is cold comfort for those who want Tunisia to be democratic, and even to be more democratic than it was in the past. There are many sorts of authoritarian regimes that could be established in the future, and I think that's a cause for great concern. Great,
thank you, Nate. Lilia, turning to you, Aymen had gone into a little bit about who came out during the constitutional referendum and who didn't, and why. I'd love your perspective, just to dig into that a little bit more on, how different sectors of society are reacting, who's supporting the transition, who are against it, what are the reasons behind different groups' decisions?
Yes, just to bounce back on what Nate said, about the judiciary, it's actually very accurate, because this week there was actually a decision from the administrative court, which is very important. Kais Saied, a few months ago, fired 57 judges based on the fact that they had different cases of corruption, or there were a lot of accusations, but mostly corruption or conflict of interest in some judicial cases. It was not based on transparency. The decision was not transparent at all. You just had a list published and with the names of the judges, and it led to a general strike in the judiciary, which lasted a month. And this week, the administrative court actually rejected the Kais Saied decision for 42 judges out of the 57, and ask them to be, reintegrated in their functions. So I think it's one of the first blow towards Kais Saied, and also it shows the independence of the judiciary to a certain extent, that, the administrative court is not supporting the way he fired those judges. To come back to your question, I would say now it's still a very divided society that we have, because we have the supporters of the start, who supported Kais Saied in his political project that he started, implementing, according to his narrative, just after the revolution. It got inspiration from the discussions he had with the protester in Casbah, which were, protests which followed the January protests in 2011. And then, he also was very active in the constitutional debate for the first constitution. He was being on TV all the time as a constitutional expert, and he had some propositions. And then, from what he's saying, he sort of started to go to a lot of regions during several years and to talk with a lot of movements and youth movements about the general change he wanted to do into the political system. So you have a good basis of supporters who is still very difficult to assess in terms of numbers, because you don't have actual research in Tunisia on electoral sociology or anthropology. And then you have the people who voted for the referendum because they didn't see any other alternative. I remember someone telling me on the market, I know the constitution is not perfect. I know that there are a lot of red flags in the new constitution, but what else can we do? Are we going back to the former system? And if it's not Kais Saied, who it will be? There is no. Nate and Aymen described the political void. So there is also this branch of society, and I would say it's different. Classes. It can be teachers. It can be also people who work in agriculture. Like, a lot of people are a bit hesitant, but it's mostly because they don't want to go back to the former system. And then you have also very, very fierce anti-Islamist people, mostly in the elites, who blame, the Islamist party for what happened in Tunisia during these 10 years, and who don't want the Islamist party to be into the political landscape, and who are supporting Kais Saied because for them he symbolizes the person who will get rid of the Islamists. And you have, of course, the political opposition, which is very, scattered, but which is still present. And I would say the most serious party who is leading an opposition of its own, because they are not really getting along with the other parties, is the party of Abir Moussi. She's a former member of parliament. She used to be part of the political party of former dictator Ben Ali. Right now, she completely rejects this past, but she still doesn't see the revolution as a revolution, and she's one of the people whose narrative is to say that, with the revolution, everything went bad in Tunisia, and she's leading the polls for the upcoming legislative elections, and she's also a very fierce opponent to the Islamists and to Kais Saied as well. So I would say that's the general framework of people who are, for Kais Saied or against Kais Saied.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lilia. What I'm going to do now, because Aymen, the question that I have for you is actually being reflected in some of the questions that I see coming in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start weaving in those questions into my next question for you, Aymen. And for those of you who are listening, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box now, and then we'll do a full transition over. So Aymen, what I wanted to talk to you about, and what it seems like some of our audience is also interested in, is what do you expect next from Kais Saied in terms of acting on his promises to change the electoral system or consolidating control of the security sector? And then one of the questioners, who is an election system expert, wants to know what kind of system might he implement in terms of the electoral system, and is this a cause of concern among pro-democracy Tunisians? So basically, what are you looking at right now in terms of his next steps and what that says about the direction?
We'll maybe start with what's next to build into the electoral system, because it's part of it, basically. So as I started to discuss earlier, and as mentioned by Lilia, many of the possibilities depend on which political party or which group may manage to gather the bulk of public opinion support, especially in the upcoming elections. The leading is obviously Abir Mossi's PTL, as Lilia mentioned. There's also the National Salvation Front, which is mainly composed of Citizens Against the Coup and another party and other allies. And the third element is the self-fashioned social democratic parties and the Labour Party. How these will influence will depend, I think, largely on what social movements and what Rigidité, the Labour Union, will do, both of which depend on the impeding IMF deal that the government has been discussing for over a year now, mainly. This is important, especially also because, as Lilia mentioned, many of Kais Saied's support system in the regions overlaps with the social movements. And actually, there have been two press statements by the coordination body of social movements that blamed the government for its inactivity and lack of action, and not Kais Saied himself. So we see a sort of insulation that Kais has managed to create a buffer between him and public grievances, basically through the government, which would also come into play, especially depending on how his new elite, basically the appointed positions in the regions and government offices, but also in the upcoming elections, how consolidated and how homogeneous that elite will be, and how supportive of his consolidation of power that system will be. On this consolidation, we are starting to see some friction between, not much, but a little friction between Kais Saied and the police unions. For context, we have a large number of police security forces unions, not just police officers, in the country since 2011. They have came under scrutiny largely by civil society and human rights defenders. They targeted activists for years, and their transgressions have been numerous, but they did not come under public scrutiny over the past years. Recently, some incidents with a comedian and with some local festivals have brought that to light, and Kais Saied has made a statement saluting police officers' efforts to protect rights and freedoms, but also calling or reiterating his call for them to unify under one single body that only manages their socioeconomic demands. This has been an issue between the unions and Saied for some time, but it is the first time it is made public. So, but his regime or under construction regime, more so, has been largely dependent on police or security forces in general. So how that will unfold is also important. Now, to get back to the elections and the electoral system, which is also really important, Kais Saied has made it clear that the upcoming elections will be unlike all other elections on individuals and not on lists. And that, I think, is very important because in many regions, if it wasn't for the support of the party or the image of the party, many candidates would not have made it to parliament. And so that political brand, but also the financial support that comes from being on a party list will not be on the table anymore. So we might see another another group of locally influential individuals, be it for family ties, or financial position, for authority, or even, which is I think what Kais Saied and his support system are counting on individuals who have been influential in social movements and protests locally, who now would have a good opportunity to make it to parliament. Another element to the electoral system would be the organizing rules and steps for the local councils and regional councils and district councils, which will be the first layer to elect the second chamber of parliament that he added. And all of these elements are actually elements of his local council-based system that he has been preaching over the last years. And this actually is not recent. In 2013, before the national dialogue, when Tunisia came to a crisis, Kais Saied suggested that a new assembly, constitutional assembly, is elected from local regions. So localities, basically, it's a small administrative unit, even sometimes smaller than a municipal council. That members of the constituent be elected directly from these constituencies. And it is at that time, in debates, through actually the network of activists he gathered during Qasba protest, that this whole project of local councilism started to take shape. And 5 years later, or 6 years later, it is on that platform that he made it to Carthage. So Kais Saied is actually delivering on what he promised, and he's the single politician who actually delivered on his promises, albeit in a problematic way, but he is delivering on what he promised.
All right, thank you. Pulling in some more questions. There's some really great ones in the Q&A box. Lilia, I'm going to turn to you now. And again, and then Nate, feel free to jump in if you'd like, on the role of the international community, which is, Aymen had just mentioned the IMF loan. So, we have one question, which is, what are some of the successes and failures of the international community in addressing what happened? And someone else wants to know is, and I'm just going to read this verbatim. Don't you think Tunisia has been a victim of exaggerated internal euphoria and external pressure after the revolution? Wouldn't it have been better for Tunisia to gradually absorb democratic values and give politicians and the people of Tunisia time to learn and change? And if yes, what lessons could we learn to avoid such mistakes in the future? So there's a lot of parts in there. I think, I'm really interested in the role of the international community, and whether or not there's been a disconnect between sort of the internal euphoria and external pressure. And then Nate, I think there's a good piece in there for you too about just how democratic values are absorbed in transition. So Lilia, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Yeah.
Thanks.
For the international community, what I can say is that you have the United States who are being very clear, and taking position on all the red flags I talked about earlier, and who are, pressuring Tunisia to sort of, restore a kind of political system with institutions. It has been also the position of the European Union with statements which were less, I would say, clear than the US, and the France, which is really important for Tunisia because it's still a very important partner commercially and economically. France has been the less clear, I would say, and they have been trying to navigate in supporting what was changing in Tunisia, and also avoiding to talk about, failure of democracy or anything like we heard in the US media, for instance. I would say it's because, Europe and France, the European Union and France as well have different interests. There is the fear mostly from the European Union, France, and also the neighboring country of Tunisia, like Algeria, of political instability, which could lead, we know, to more migration, irregular migration towards the borders, of Europe, like in the uprising of 2011. So we must also have that in mind. And I would say the US, they are more about the, what Nate said, what is the definition of a democracy, and do we check the box in this way? And right now it's true, it's very complex, but we don't check all the boxes. So I would say that's the general attitude. And but moving forward, the negotiations with the IMF, which are presented as really important by the government to help the economy of Tunisia, are going well, according to most press releases of the IMF and what the government is saying. There is also this big conference at the end of the month with the Japanese cooperation, which the government is really pushing for, which could lead to more commercial ties with Japan. So economically, you can see that the political situation have less impact than we think for now. But correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert in diplomacy and geopolitics. To come back on the second question, which is very interesting but very difficult to answer, I would say two things. It's first, I think we underestimated Tunisia and also overestimated Tunisia. Underestimated Tunisia because I remember a lot of media were saying after the first months of the uprising, Tunisia is going to become an Islamist republic. It's going to be a failure that, like the other countries of the Arab Spring. You had this narrative, especially when the Islamists won the first democratic elections. And I would say, Tunisia has proven wrong all those experts and pundits through the years, because we really tried for several years, to build a political system that was sustainable. But I would say where we overestimated and where I'm completely agreeing with the maybe exaggerated euphoria is that a lot of people also thought we can build a sustainable democracy in 10 years, whereas it has taken so many countries so much more, So, and I think even Tunisians, they were expecting a lot. And I think the main failure, and Aymen and Nate already say that, the main failure is the failure of the political system, the elites, and the media as well, to make the democratic values converge with the expectations for the improving of the living conditions of Tunisia. Basically, if you look at the numbers from the Arab Barometer, in 2011, I think it was 70% Tunisians who were believing in the fact that democracy would change their lives. And 10 years after, the Arab Barometer says that it's only 17%. So I think this number is really interesting, is that Tunisians, they don't believe in democracy as a system which can be efficient to improve their lives daily. And that's the main failure, to make the ideals of democracy important enough for Tunisians to defend. And that's why a lot of people were surprised when no one, I really mean no one except for some deputies, went to defend the parliament on the 25th of July. You had a military truck closing the doors of parliament, and you had no one except for a flock of, I would say, 50 people, mostly from the Islamist party, defending the parliament, which is the most important, institution of the political system after the revolution. So I think that's, what we can, say about the general euphoria.
Yeah, that's an incredibly telling anecdote. Nate, on that second piece about whether or not it would have been better for Tunisia to gradually absorb democratic values and give politicians and people in Tunisia time to learn and change, what are your thoughts on that?
I honestly just don't think it was really a viable option. there were really significant protests in 2011 when Ben Ali led the country. There was this rise in insecurity. Many of the political elites in the country actually tried to embark on a more limited transition, and they were pressured by people on the streets to concede to constituent assembly elections. So I don't think it was an option. I also wanted to add, I just think what Lilia said about Tunisia being underestimated and overestimated is very profound. I think whether we believe that that the fact that Tunisia has been able to regularly hold elections in which losers concede and winners, agree to hold elections in the future, to what extent is that, an impressive success? I think that depends on kind of what we imagine as the alternatives.
Thank you. Yeah, we just had an interesting conversation the other week about South Africa and democracy in South Africa, and some of those same themes came up about, sort of where expectations, how do we manage expectations in the light of a very difficult and complex transition? And so I think that it's really important to talk about that gray area. Aymen, I wanted to turn to you. We have a question here. Please feel free to comment on it or pass as you wish, but it's about some of the regional political and economic implications of what's happening in Tunisia within the broader Middle East, and how you see the transition affecting how Tunisia is being viewed, either in the Middle East or beyond.
Yeah, thank you. Before that, I wanted to maybe add something to the previous question. I think managing expectations depends on what expectations, who makes them, and based on what. I mean, I'm gonna call the elephant in the room, and basically Tunisia was hailed, and again, as Lilia mentioned, underestimated and overestimated, because there's an underlying thinking that the Arab world or the MENA region or SWANA, or depending on how you classify the region, is not one fit for democracy, maybe. So there has been some Orientalist tropes in both estimations, actually, over and underestimate Tunisia, and there has been some moments wherein people on the ground and civil society, etc., felt that there was some sort of a burden that we had to succeed because everyone is counting on us to succeed. But whereas it's just like people were managing the day-to-day and trying to create a system that is representative, that guarantees rights and freedoms, and that and support the state to function and provide for its population. So basically, Tunisia is one country among many going through a transition, a political one, that happened to coincide, or that stirred, depending on how you look at it, with others in the same region. And on the learning and change, I guess it's an understatement to say that there hasn't been a democratic learning. I mean, if you look at the turnout rate, even a downward turnout rate, is reflective of a political learning, of people feeling apathetic and refusing or not caring enough to go and vote, which is a political message to politicians if they would listen. Also, if you look at the percentages of votes and number of seats that another party, which was the biggest party and the single constant in all ruling coalitions, people did punish another party, and they lost votes and they lost seats. And with every loss that they were subjected to, the option or the possibility for consensus became more difficult, and so more issues happened at the governance level, and then people became more disillusioned with democracy. And instead of fixing the problems, for example, the threshold of the electoral law to allow for a single ruling majority, the parties try to utilize that. And so it is a host of issues and a patchwork of crises and of maybe lost decisions or unmade decisions that further complicated the success of the transition and led us to July of last year. On your question, I think, well, geopolitically speaking, Tunisia hasn't been very influential over the past few years. We're actually even grown isolated. And I'm not really, I don't really adhere to the narrative that there is yes, there are regional and coalitions that change depending on how regional and international alliances and interests change. But the idea that if a party affiliated to a particular political family that happens to exist in the majority of the region loses in this country, that will directly affect another country, I'm not really in favor of that.
Great. Thank you. And I really appreciate your remarks earlier too about democracy and expectations. We have just a few minutes left, and so what I wanted to do is maybe just go around our Zoom room, and if each of you could say one indicator that you're watching for in terms of next steps and where you think things are going, because a lot of this conversation has centered around this gray area, right? That it might be too early to call, right? On paper it looks like things have, you could definitely say it's not democratic, but on the other hand, there are some signs of life. And so what are some of the indicators that you're looking for over the next 6 months or so to say that, hey, this is going in one direction or the other? And Nate, why don't I start with you, and then I'll go Lilia and Aymen.
I was hoping to have another minute to think, but I'll jump in. So I'm definitely watching the courts to see whether repression of the opposition increases. There have been a large number of political figures who have been called in before the courts. Some of them have been convicted, perhaps rightly or wrongly, but I'm watching the courts as well as the negotiations with the IMF and the actions of the UGTT.
Okay, great, thanks. Lilia.
So I think I would be watching closely one of the great supporters of Kais Saied that I didn't mention earlier, which is the deep state establishment. We must not forget that, Kais Saied managed to do everything he did with the support of the army, the police, and the administration. And this deep state establishment has interest, they are not, they are supporting Kais Saied because right now he's serving their interests, but it could completely change in the coming months. And we could see that, especially with the confrontation with the police unions, for instance, and the Ministry of Interior trying to change the way the police works, as Aymen mentioned. And I think it's very important because when I ask people during the referendum campaign, do you fear that if Kais Saied is not here anymore, if someone replaces him, basically the new constitution is a handbook for any dictatorship, and someone with very bad intentions can, use the new constitution in a very bad way, because everyone was saying, Kais Saied won't be a dictator. He's so clean. He's so honest. And everyone was saying, no, we will push him, towards the exit. And it's a bit naive because the new constitution is really preventing you from doing that. So I think we have to watch this closely, because the system that brought Kais Saied into power can also, turn against him. And it's very important. And I just wanted to mention also something. The beacon of hope that I am also watching is the reshaping of civil society. I think there are a lot of, self-criticism, questioning about how do we oppose to this new kind of power? How do we, where do we belong in this new republic that Kais Saied is trying to install? And what kind of resistance can we present? And I think that's important. And the last, I think, remaining assets that Tunisians have, we must not forget, is the freedom of speech. It might be cliche to say that, but this whole year, I was able to do interviews of so many people, And even before the referendum, everyone would talk, you know, and they were not afraid, even in regions, to criticize Kais Saied or to say, you know, I'm supporting him. So I think it's very important. And that's also the bittersweet aspect of the democracy, is that Tunisians completely seized this freedom of speech assets, but are also very disappointed with what it brought them. And I remember a Tunisian rapper saying to me, we have the power to express ourselves freely, which we didn't have under the dictatorship. But to me, it seems like we bark like dogs, but we are never heard. And I think it's also very important, you know, to remember that Tunisians for a long time after the revolution didn't feel like they were heard by the political system.
100%, that's what we heard. Aymen, final thoughts.
I'll be watching definitely the IMF deal, as Nate mentioned, but also not if, but when and how quickly he will try to revoke Decree 88 on civil society and the decree on the media and press. So depending on how there is a slight, although unlikely possibility that he would refrain from doing so, but indicators point towards an attack on civil society to try and limit the organization prospects, or at least limit their access to foreign funds, as well as try to limit the freedom of media and press, and already eliminating the media and press authority from the constitution is telling of an intention to limit that space.
Well, thank you all for participating today, for your very wise and well-received words, and thank you to everyone in the audience. There were some really great questions in there. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. We didn't get to even, you know, talk a lot about economics, and you know, there's a lot in there, but you know, we had only an hour. So thank you again for participating. Just a few notes for those of you who are listening. Network 2020 is working on a few other things. We have a call for applications for our Innovators Awards in Global Affairs. The nominees are due a week from tomorrow. So we're looking for organizations, companies, institutions, initiatives that are less than 10 years old, that are really working, that are SDG aligned. So, you know, institutions in governance, environment, economic growth, communications and civic engagement, and I think I forgot one, environment maybe. But anyway, we're looking for organizations, initiatives less than 10 years old. We will honor them in New York on September 28th at our gala, at which we will also honor the CEO of Deloitte Global, Puneet Renjan, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. So it should be a really fun event. If you are in New York and you want to come, please get tickets. The early bird ends on Monday. So there's a significant discount, so please get your tickets now. And again, thank you to all of you for the work that you do and for participating today. And have a great afternoon and evening, everyone.